Really great to be with you. For us, it's afternoon. I think for those in Africa, that's the same. I'm not sure, but I think it's Sri Lanka, Prince. Or not sure where you're based, but we're coming from the afternoon. The US side, it's in the morning. And it's very hot here in Cape Town. And Tando's not in Cape Town, but she looks like it's also hot where she is in South Africa. So just, yeah, greetings from myself, Nadine, and then also from Ntando. Just to say that Ntando is both a PhD candidate, but she is also a lecturer at the University of South Africa, currently in church history. And soon, Beth, I think your words are prophetic. Soon she will be a doctor. So we're all holding thumbs that will be soon. But I'm just really grateful that she agreed to be on this call with me, because the book, yes, I'm the editor, but the book really showcases a number of different voices. And I felt Ntando would be a good voice to join mine. Not to say that we've also been on other webinars together for other things. So thanks, Ntando, just for joining. So what I'm going to do now is share PowerPoint. We will try not to do death by PowerPoint. We're not going to kill you with a PowerPoint. But it just helps, I think, to give us a framework. And we'll talk through it also to each other. So I've said to Ntando, like, step in, or I'll step in on what she's saying. And then, of course, we'll have Q&A time afterwards, which Beth will lead us in. So let me just share my screen and get it looking like it should. Hopefully everyone can see it. Just give me a thumbs up, Ntando. Okay, I see Beth is nodding. That's good. So the book that I've edited is called Faith, Race, and Inequality Amongst Young Adults in South Africa. There is a subtitle, Contested and Contesting Discourses for a Better South Africa. And you'll see on the cover, so I put the cover of the book on because the picture was specifically chosen. The individuals that you see on the cover, with permission, are some of our former students at the University of Stellenbosch Faculty of Theology. And this is a very powerful image that was taken during what we called #FeesMustFall protests. And Ntando, I think, will talk us through a little bit more about that. But where students throughout South Africa were protesting for free and decolonized education. But we'll break down what that means as we go on. But just to say that this is a very special picture to me, and that actually at the book launch, we presented a copy of this book to each of the students that are featured in this particular picture. So I wanted to start off with us thinking about, like, why this book. So I'm sure you're wondering why this book. What's the reason for talking about faith, race, and inequality? If you say those things in South Africa, everyone will know. It's fairly obvious to us as South Africans. But even for us as South Africans, it's not always obvious as to what's really meant here. So you'll see in this slide a cover of Time magazine, I think it was 2019, where it's calling us the world's most unequal country. And if you look at the cover, you can literally see the inequality as depicted, with a particular highway separating literally people that have pools, gardens, etc., from what we call townships, where people are really living in abject poverty. And that's how close inequality is in South Africa, literally divided by a highway. So in 1994, when we became a democratic country and we saw the end of the fall of apartheid, some would argue we haven't yet seen that fully. Archbishop Desmond Tutu called us the Rainbow Nation. Sadly, where we sit today, the dream of the Rainbow Nation has faded. And unfortunately, we continue to display high levels of race-based inequality. So you can see in the title, we talk about race and we also talk about inequality in the same sentence. And this is now 28 this year, it will be 29 years after the advent of democracy. The time cover was, of course, based on the World Bank report, which identified us as the most unequal nation in the world. We usually compete with Brazil for this dubious honor. It's either us or Brazil, but it looks like currently we are the most unequal country. And inequality has actually increased since the end of apartheid in 1994. And you can see that the top percentile of households maintain 70.9% of the wealth, whilst the bottom 60% have only 7% of the wealth. So according to the World Bank, nearly half of the population is considered chronically poor. And if you take that half and you add another 26%, 76% of the total population actually experiences poverty as a constant threat in their lives. So that means nearly half are chronically poor, and then you have another 20-odd% who actually, you know, for any small reason could then fall into chronic poverty. So the other why this book, of course, the other part of the title is young adults. And I'm going to speak a little bit, and then Ntanda's going to talk a little bit also to what I've said and add from her perspective as a young adult. So children born post-1994, who are the young adults of today, the kind of those that are 29 and under, more or less, although in this case, we use the band in South Africa that's termed 18 to 35 or determined as young adults. But most of these kids were called the born frees because they were born after the dawn of democracy. However, many born frees today would say we were not actually born free. We were born into the same struggles that many of our parents had, the same socioeconomic struggles. And the reason for this is that South Africa has high levels of youth unemployment. And then sadly, it also has low levels of intergenerational socioeconomic mobility. So those of us that have managed to escape it, we're the outliers. I'm an outlier, for example. Most people of my generation would not be professors. Social connections assist in facilitating job searches. Yet a 2018 report of the state of youth wellbeing in South Africa, issued by the South African Labour and Development Research Unit, that's at the University of Cape Town, indicated that 62.2% of youth live in income-poor households. So you can see the sort of combination: high youth unemployment, income-poor households, low levels of intergenerational social mobility. And young people are also currently the largest cohort of new job seekers in a country where we already have a very high unemployment rate. And unfortunately, these unemployment rates and poverty are all still aligned, sadly, to the legacy of the past. So there's a racial element to it. So in this particular book, we define young adults as between 18 and 35. And like I said, that's according to the way our South African government understands young adults. And the interesting thing is that in the midst of all of this, South Africa is notoriously religious, with a large percentage of the population confessing the Christian faith. I would say about 80, as I read yesterday, 82%. Now, of course, we can start to question, what does that mean? If people self-identify as Christian, does that mean that they're adherent? You know, do they attend services weekly, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? That remains to be seen, but at least in terms of affiliation. And we also have a history of faith-motivated youth activism. So, Ntando, maybe you can come in here on your perspectives of young adults. Yeah.
Yes, so just continuing this discussion around why this book and centering it around the youth, particularly in South Africa, we have a youth that is in this under 29 space. I am part of the 93 babies, but I was 5 months old when the born frees became born frees. So I'm basically a born free. But I think the youth have been facing this the sense of continuing to have to be resilient. So from birth, they're born into this born-free era, and they're the hope of this new South Africa. But some are born in abject poverty. Some continue to live in spaces which don't promote healthy mental health. I was reading the other day for another book chapter that psychologists in Cape Town have studied 1,000 youth in Mitchell's Plain, Khayelitsha and Gugulethu, and found that socioeconomic factors do factor in to our mental health. And so have had to deal with that, as well as the hope deferred from seeing the legacy of apartheid being continued in our spaces, being continued in how people are educated, so public education versus private education, and then moving into the job market and seeing that the hope deferred continues there and at a much wider scale. And then again, what Nadine said around carrying the weight of our parents. So initially when I was young, I was always told, you know, you guys are the hope of the future. We had to carry what was called a dompas. And now you guys get to do everything that we couldn't do. And in that sense, in one way,
just explain what the dompas is.
So the dompas is a identification document that was carried by people of color in South Africa up until the early 90s, I believe, or the late 80s.
Late 80s.
Late 80s. And that was basically the identification of your race, and then would allow you into certain areas. And if you were someone who worked for a white family or white corporation, allowed you into white areas, quote unquote, for certain periods of time. So it policed movement, it policed the freedom of association, and in some senses also policed churches, because in some churches, obviously, then things like communion was separated based on race. So in that sense, they were saying, we've thrown those things away, we've done the work, you now live the dream that we've always had. But the dream isn't coming to be as fully as South Africans had hoped. And I think the mirage has been that there has been a growth in the middle class and people of other races entering the middle class, but it still remains that there is this big gap in terms of land ownership, in terms of educational capacity and the like. And so inequality is very much heavy on the youth's shoulders. And so I think from that context, then one had to see a book around the youth who was told to be the future and yet cannot be because it's stuck in the past. And then a youth that is still battling this, this connection between race and inequality in South Africa.
Totally. And I think, you know, Ntando used the phrase, the dream deferred. So it was originally, I think, coined by W.E. Du Bois. In the US, he talked about what happens to a dream deferred, it explodes. And I think, was it Thabo Mbeki or his brother, Ntando, that also kind of talked around the dream deferred. Thabo Mbeki is one of our previous presidents, and his brother is a political commentator, so I can't remember which Mbeki it was. But, you know, that's where we're currently sitting now. Is the dream so deferred that it will explode? And so we're sitting on a powder keg in many ways. Yeah, so thanks for bringing that one up also, Ntando. So, I mean, just to talk to more of what Ntando said, Ntando, you can come in here as well. You know, this is just, you can just see a picture there of young adults saying, employ the youth. Temporary post shows there are vacancies. So the unemployment rate, particularly for young adults, was 42.1% for those aged 25 to 34 years. Weirdly enough, in this quarterly labor force survey, I was a bit confused by this. I need to engage an economist on this one. But they actually had a band 15 to 24 and then 25 to 34. And for the 15 to 24, the unemployment rate was actually, I think, lower, but I'm assuming the 15 to 18. So most people in South Africa, we would, of course, one would want them to finish their formal schooling, which ends at 18 usually, but we have many dropouts for various reasons. So perhaps that's why they use 15. Anyway, but you can see that the unemployment rate is even higher than our current official national rate of 34.5. Of course, in this breakdown, there are different definitions of unemployment. And I'm not sure which this one refers to, because some unemployment rates refer to people that are actually still seeking work, and others exclude that. And then the rates go up even higher. So you may read elsewhere that the rate is even higher. This is still pretty scary. I don't know what it is in the US. I know in Western Europe, I don't know what it is in the other countries represented here. In Western Europe, I remember having a little bit of a giggle in, I think it was in Finland, where they said, it's alarming, our unemployment rate is 3%. And I was like, try 30 odd. This is such an issue that we have a term called NEET youth that are not in employment, education, or training. In other words, they are literally on the street. It's also important to note that we have essentially two economies, a formal economy and an informal economy. So people are also not always counted that are operating in the informal economy. So, and then what becomes even more troublesome is that we have people who are university graduates, particularly, I would say, because of the low social mobility, you have Black graduates who are still not employed. And that for me is a real travesty. It's a travesty overall, but that for me, you know, as an academic is really worrying. So, and it's interesting that apparently Stats SA said that unemployment rate amongst graduates is declining. That's something positive, but it's still increasing for those between 25 and 34 years. So the graduates below 25, they are being employed. Those between 25 and 34 already dropping off the radar. So another why this book, so why faith? In South Africa, you know, I just said high numbers of South Africans actually self-identify as Christians. And it was very interesting. A few years ago, my mother, of all people, went to a conference. She's not an academic, by the way. She is a missions leader, and she came home with this Connected Generation Barna report, which actually looked at it polled Christian young adults throughout the world. There are several case study countries, but it looked at 18 to 25-year-olds. So if you're on this call, your country might have been part of this particular Barna study, and you can maybe go and look at that. I think it's co-sponsored by World Vision and Biblica, if I'm not mistaken, and then also Barna Group. So what I found really interesting was that over 70% of 18 to 35s that were polled in South Africa, I think they did like 1,000, I think their sample was around 1,000, so not huge, Beth, statistically, but anyway, 70% of 18 to 35s polled both either strongly believed or believed that religion is good for people and that religion is important to society. So you can see for young adults, religion is still seen as positive, as important in society. An overwhelming 81% indicated that their religious faith was very important in their lives. And 47% indicated that the church was very important to society. And then this also sort of spiraled into how they think about helping others. 71% said it's because of their beliefs that they think it's important to give of their time to help others in need. 63% felt that because of my beliefs, it's important that I give of my own resources to help others in need. A little bit less there, but still greater than 50. And 61% indicated that because of my beliefs, it's important that I stand up to corruption. We are also experiencing, I think, a corruption pandemic. Although I must say the apartheid government was equally corrupt, it is just very sad that we have not transformed the way the economy operates, the way government operates in terms of corruption. But these are all interesting and, positive perspectives on young adults and how they view social change. And I think especially for those of us in the development space, often maybe youth are targeted, but young adults are excluded in terms of saying, how can we use them as volunteers? How can we engage them in terms of what we're doing, even in terms of volunteering, but even in terms of giving? Of course, there's also black tax, which we can talk about. But I think this is quite interesting. Thando, over to you. Do you want to say something there?
Just on the next slide.
Yes,
we got to that. So in South Africa, we've obviously had a history around faith combined with activism, and we've had a history of having to have faith mixed with activism. And we were talking before the call started around apartheid theology and some churches having supported the apartheid regime, and then having a lot of English-based churches, but also churches with mostly Black and brown people really fighting against this theology, this theologizing, using separate development, and this thought of the supremacy of the Afrikaner person. So we do have a history around our activism being mixed with our faith. And I do believe that during Rhodes Must Fall and Fees Must Fall, and this is a term or a range of terms that we've used from 2015 to around 2017, but we still use it today. Rhodes Must Fall was a coordinated effort by initially the University of Cape Town students to remove Cecil John Rhodes's statue from the just above what is called the Green Mile, which is just a central part of University of Cape Town, but it also spread over to the UK where Cecil John Rhodes is from. And there's a whole history around who Cecil John Rhodes was, but he was deeply involved in the colonial network and also just spreading the colonial message of Anglo supremacy, can I say. And then we had Fees Must Fall, which came on the backs of Rhodes Must Fall, seeing that students and young adults in general really wanted to see a road to free education, because at that time there were increases of up to 9-10% per year on university fees, and they were becoming way above what any even middle to lower middle class family could afford, but also looking at how to create an education that is telling the realities of who they are as well, because they are knowledge systems that are outside of university systems that haven't been tapped into. And students really realized that because that's what they were from, and were realizing that they were, as I was speaking before, living this resilience, then getting to spaces of universities and seeing the faces of Cecil John Rhodes instead of the faces that they know and the stories that they know, perhaps of Shaka Zulu or Nongqawuse, and then continuing to be told stories that are not of their own, that all came together in Rhodes Must Fall and Fees Must Fall. And then in conjunction, we found that churches, but also FPOs were getting involved at the same time with young activists who still had their faith. We just mentioned around over 80% of South Africans saying that they follow the Christian faith. And we found that there were a lot of them also questioning and wrestling with how their faith was involved with this activism. I had a number of friends on campus at Rosemasville. I actually worked for the University of Cape Town as a marketing intern in the same year. So I was actually there when they took down Cecil John Rhodes. And I would want to mention a little piece around just how the blindness of those in power has led to these things like roads must fall and fees must fall. So after the April removal of Cecil John Rhodes, I worked for the marketing team. And afterwards, which was an awkward event, actually, there was a champagne event at the office to celebrate the end of this nasty season for this marketing team. And one of the people in power had said something quite interesting, and it stuck with me till today, because Rhodes Must Fall was also the impetus for me to really search my faith and activism and a journey into theology. She said, "Oh, finally, this thing is over." And I remember thinking to myself, one, you're carrying a champagne glass, like this was fun, but also you're completely mistaken. It's not over. And September that year, we had Fees Must Fall. And so we see that our young adults are seeing what their parents fought, and see the reason to claim the hope deferred, and continue in their activism, and then also ask questions and challenge their faith communities to walk that journey with them. Yeah, so we see that in South Africa, this activism inspired by faith, and we have a lot of the chapter writers also having that tension in the book as well.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Ntando. Thanks for sharing that. I spoke about the cover of the book, right, and being our very own theology students. And it was really, since you're telling stories, that it was really interesting that at Stellenbosch University, the leaders, a number of the leaders of Feast Must Fall were theology students. And so that also really stood out for me. Here were theology students that were leading, you know, these protests on campus. And Lee's study that I referred to here, though, is an indictment on us as the church. I include myself in that. Is where young people express disappointment with church settings and said, actually, you know, the church wasn't there for me during that time. Where was the church? Obviously, there were those of us. There was, for example, Ntando also knows there was the Peace and Justice Witnesses, which was originally a faith-based initiative. And we were trained to be peace observers on campus. I had a bit of a double role there because I'm part of the oppressive system. But at our faculty, we facilitated training. We offered our space for training of peace and justice witnesses, and we would have to go and observe. And I would say to our theology students, I come in peace. I'm wearing the verb. I'm not here as a professor. In that stage, you know, I'm not here as a lecturer. I'm here to observe. So, but yes, and it is not yet over, Ntando. I think you would agree. As much as the protests are over, we still have a long way to go in terms of our education. So, you know, the book really wants to challenge clergy, community workers, academics like ourselves who work in higher education institutions, and then also young adults to think about how can youth activism be rooted and sustained by faith and within faith communities, challenging faith communities to think about that, encouraging young adults that it is okay to think about these things. The socio-political is also part of our faith, and we're not dualistic. We don't have to separate out faith and the socio-political. So what's in the book? I know we only have like a minute or two. So there's three parts to the book. The first part is we termed it looking back, moving forward, intergenerational reflections. So here I had two colleagues who are in their 50s. One of whom is my dean, but his scholarly field is youth ministry. And then also there's a very interesting chapter written by a young adult who has a PhD, and then also this is very interesting. So Wilhelm Verwoerd is the co-author, and Louis van der Riet. They wrote it together. They both come from the Dutch Reformed Church, and Wilhelm Verwoerd's grandfather was actually the grand architect of apartheid. He has obviously denounced everything around that. And today he's actually a peace and justice activist. And they write particularly around how the Dutch Reformed Church, which was the church that, there were many churches that supported apartheid, but the Dutch Reformed Church gave birth, I would say, to the ideology or the theology, the heresy of apartheid, and how to within that church start to address issues there. The second part is at unequal intersection, so looking more intersectionally at these issues. Ntando and I both contribute chapters on place, and of course when we talk about place we have to talk about race. There's also chapters on gender, and what are the challenges to church and academia in tackling these issues. And then part 3, dare we hope, despite all of these things that we've talked about, agency and means to change. And, so how do the lived realities, hopes, expectations of young adults themselves help to thicken, trouble, reframe issues of faith and theological conviction in our context? And there we hope for a brighter future. So there are 12 chapters, there are 15 authors. Ntando was also hinting at the fact that a number of the authors were young adults. I was very specific about that as an editor, and I was very specific around diversity in terms of age, gender, and race. There are too many books in South Africa where the majority of the population is people of color, which is, just being edited books where there's not one voice of color. So really it's a diverse publication, and it's one that I'm actually very proud of for that reason, and for I think the richness that comes from having different voices come through. So Ntando, I don't know, just like 1 minute, I don't know if there's anything you want to say on the content of the book.
Just say that this book for me is just promotes how the youth have this sense of innovation and a renewed mind around how to do activism, but also alongside their faith, and do it now in the 21st century. And then it also just promotes of local stories, but also reflects stories across the world around inequality, race, and then place as well. And so in this sense, I'm very proud of being a part of it. And I would, strongly suggest that you get the book, but also that you as development workers then focus on young adults as well, and not simply as young adults as volunteers, but also young adults in their minds and how they create community, because they are the community now and of the future. So yeah, that's it from me.
Yeah, thanks, Ntando. I had to put in a picture of two of our current student leaders, Linda Kuchle and Aldi. And on the left is my dean, and I'm on the right. And that day we were recording some promotional material for our faculty, and I hung around, typical me. We first had our faculty members talking, blah, blah, blah. And then afterwards, when the students had their turn, I hung around to listen to them. And as always, exceptionally inspired by what these two young women, in particular, we're talking about the Alliance today, young women see as their role in South Africa today. So with that, on that note, we'll end our presentation and then stop for some conversation.
That's great. Thank you so much. Yeah, I've got an even bigger understanding and expanse of the book. So really, really well done. I would encourage, anybody, like I said, the issues that you talk about, I couldn't help but continue to think about how they transcend boundaries, geographic boundaries. When I started working in South Africa in the 90s, one of my African-American faculty colleagues and I were doing the work together, and we just were struck by the parallels of the South African racial justice journey to America's, and how at the time, again, thinking this is the mid-90s, late 90s, how we felt South Africa had gone so much further than the United States in addressing racial justice, calling it out, putting, good frameworks in place, and that was just the start. I mean, so it was the beginning of your journey, and yet the United States, we had passed the Civil Rights Act in the 60s and still felt like we hadn't made the dent, that South Africa had made. Now, no journey is a straight line. And so for your country and ours, it's a straight line, and then it's a backtrack, and then it's, so 2 steps forward, 5 steps back, 5 steps forward, 2 steps back. And that's where the faith comes in. The Bible doesn't say that our lives are going to continue on a journey of perpetual goodness. We know what the end is going to look like, and it's not pretty. So, but that doesn't dismiss our responsibility and our call as people who love Jesus and people of faith to hold on to that hope. So, yeah, I want to just thank you again for coming, but open it up to our colleagues who are on the call for any questions or things you have for Nadine and Ntando about what they shared, or even just thoughts of your own context that it brought to mind.
I think that from my perspective, I was curious what when the parents said that they carried the cards with them. I'm sorry, I don't remember the word for the card that showed their race and whether or not they could be someplace. When those parents saw that their children were fighting for different rights and different, like in a different context, but the same thing, essentially equality among everyone, what was their response, or has there been a response from them that was almost like reviving and restoring that excitement in maybe their youth and making those changes? Has that been evident?
There's a mix of reactions. There was a famous activist, Frank Chikane. His son was actually a part of Fees Must Fall in 2015. And he, in a sense, was saying that his son has every right to be a part of this because it's in his blood to fight. But then you'll find other parents that may not understand why the fight is continuing. I've heard other parents say, we did this, like, please just don't start this again, because we know the cost of this. And I think they're speaking from the traumatic experience of not just being active, but really losing loved ones in the process. So there is that sense of fear that we've done this before. We don't want to do this again with our children. So there was a large amount of different opinions around the previous generation, and then one would have to speak about the governing party and its sort of weird ways of responding. It had at one point really supportive, and then a crushing response as well with the police presence. So we did have disappointing responses and also supportive responses, and all those are coming from some sort of place with a fear or the governing party trying to keep the power together, or parents who are really positive around their kids continuing to do the work that is yet to be fulfilled.
And that, I think, yeah, you're totally right, like in terms of the mixed response. And, you know, what I also saw, so I'm from the rainbow generation, right? So I'm the 1990s baby, not baby, I was a young adult in the 1990s when we had our first democratic elections, and we were kumbaya, you know, it's going to be wonderful. So I'm the in-between generation. But I think for, yes, the parents of those people, what was also interesting were people of color who were not, parents of color who were not engaged. So you had parents of color who were politically active, like Frank Chikane Ntando mentioned. I mean, he was a famous activist and church leader, clergy person, or my own parents or whatever. But then there were those who, because of their faith, were told that they should not oppose the government. And so for them, it brought back, but we were taught this, you know, particularly as Christians. So why are you doing this now? And why are you burning the infrastructure that we built, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, definitely mixed, I think mixed. And one of the reasons why it was interesting to me that it was very clear one of the themes was intergenerational dialogue, was that there was a real need for that. Younger activists said, like, we're not the first people to do this. Why aren't those who have been doing this for a long time coming forward and standing with us? So that's why I think there's a need for intergenerational dialogue. The part of the background to the book is that I led an empirical research project on this whole notion of born free and young adults, race and inequality. And yeah, in terms of the empirical work, it was showing the same thing. Why is the older generation not standing with us? And then we actually offered a short course to young adults called Young Adults in Social Justice, or for them. And one of the key guest speakers I had was a activist who's now in his 60s. And that was one of their favorite talks. So yeah, thanks, Jackie.
We have 2 questions in the chat box.
Yes,
Nadine, you had mentioned the formal and informal economy. And so for people who will be viewing this later who may not know what that means,
sure.
Can you share?
Sure. So when I say that, Prince, it means like we almost have parallel economies, right? So you have your formal economy where GDP is measured in industry and so forth. And then the informal is your survivalist. This is where people are hawking vegetables on the side of the road or washing cars. And I don't know what other examples, there are many, many examples. But essentially, they're not part of the formal economy. They're not reaping the benefits of the formal economy. But they are.
They're also not being counted.
They're also not being counted, but they are economically active. But it's usually survivalist. And that's a feature of inequality.
What would you say is the percentage of formal economy?
I do not have that on my.
No. And I'm not even sure who tries to measure it. I remember
the
all over
economists
Africa. No, that's true. Any economists on the call are an Islamist. All over Africa.
My cousin actually did sorry to cut you off. My cousin actually did a master's on the formal economy. Yeah. And she says it there as well. It's very hard to track it because of its informality, but it does bring in a number of billions of rands, and it has no set of regulations with regards to tax or value-added tax, but also it doesn't get any support with regards to loans or growth loans or grants. And so it's unable to give to the country at the level that it can. And then obviously not regulating it means that it doesn't flow into the GDP and allow for more money for societal needs.
Yeah. Another question that posted, and I realized that many people don't know the background of the church and the church's role in creating a theology of apartheid, of oppression. So what do you mean by saying that South Africa is notoriously religious? Explain that comment, but before doing that, also give a little bit of that background that many folks don't know about, where apartheid was defended by theologians, developed by an apartheid theology.
Sure. Maybe Ntando is the church historian, so maybe you could give a bit more on the on the history. I'll talk about the notoriously religious today.
Yeah.
Putting you on the spot.
South Africa, in a sense, like other countries which were colonized, there was this in history, this colonial strategy, in a sense, to bring settlers as well as missionaries. So one can read into how this colonial sense of expansion was also the expansion of the Christian faith. So they were brought hand in hand. So yes, there was a sense of slavery, but then there was also this expansion of the word to all the ends of the earth. But obviously we know that expansion in the terms of coloniality was not this expansion, I think, that Jesus of the manger meant. But then there's this expansion into South Africa with capitalism and forming refreshment stations. So South Africa was seen as this great pit stop on the journey to spices in India. And so that was initially why the Portuguese, English, and the Dutch were fighting over certain parts of it. And then you see settlers coming in as well as missionaries. So our religious history is brought in by missionaries, but you also find, which is a very understudied space. I was talking to Nadine earlier about understudied histories around missionary helpers. So missionaries also had helpers within communities, Zulu communities, Xhosa communities, Tswana, Sotho, that are very well known but understudied, and they themselves helped to promote the word in languages of the society, but also within the culture of society, so people may understand the Christian faith with their own hearts and minds. So that's where the history of the Christian faith being so widespread in South Africa began.
Good. And Nadine, what was you made a comment about notoriously religious. Is that referring to the 84% that shows
that
up?
was referring to the 84%. So Barbara, on our continent of, I don't know if you are in Africa, but on our continent, you can't talk about anything without talking about religion. So, versus in the West, when I talk about poverty and inequality, and they go, oh, like Christians are talking about this? Not everywhere, obviously, especially in Europe, they're very secularized. But I mean, on our continent, like, you have to, if you're a Christian, you are expected somehow, or the church is expected to engage in the public sphere. So that's what I meant by notoriously religious, and with our high levels of particularly adherence to the Christian faith. But then, of course, we also have Muslim adherents, Hindu and Jews, but overwhelmingly Christian. And then also the Christian community is also very diverse. So we have the usual mainline churches, like Anglicans and Presbyterians, Methodists, etc., Baptists. But then we also have African independent churches. You would have them, the white garment churches in other parts of the continent, which are huge. Then I was talking about that. They're huge but understudied. And then also growing neo-Pentecostal. I'm a classical Pentecostal, but growing neo-Pentecostal independent church movement in South Africa. So that's kind of what it looks like in South Africa currently. And sadly, our census used to look at religious affiliation, we're trying, I think we're fighting now to get it back in. But I think in the household surveys, they've started doing that now and again. But we don't even need to ask, we know. You can just go down any road and you'll see a church and you'll see a mosque and so forth.
We have that in America. And interestingly, about that same percentage still on annual surveys declared, about 82%, 84%. Now,
really?
I think that's
in the US?
I think it has declined the last few years. But claims Christian, but I think it's because they don't, it's I'm Christian by default because I'm not
Yes.
Muslim, because I'm not
Yes.
Jewish. I just check the box for Christian. I'd have to go and look at our census to see, is there agnostic? Is there no religious, non-religious? And I do think here in America, we call it the rise of the nuns. So the people who do identify as non-religious affiliation. We have a religion though. Everybody has a religion, whether it's worshiping a god or worshiping money. So here in America, I would say it's the economic system we worship. Because everything is built on a transactional posture. I don't invest in this relationship more than I get back. I don't, so everything's transactional, which is rooted in, more of an economic framework. So, Barbara, where are you hailing from? You can take yourself off mic.
I'm Ugandan, and
Hey!
I'm calling in from Uganda. I'm in Kampala.
Okay.
I got introduced to the Christian Alliance by my boss like 2 days ago.
Who's your boss?
I work with World Renew. So I'm the regional director for World Renew for East Africa. I oversee Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania, but I'm located here in Uganda. So Carol, our co-director, talked to me about this like 2 days ago on Tuesday. So I quickly got online.
And you joined at the perfect time to have a wonderful conversation about youth in Africa and youth globally, specifically on this conversation.
Yeah, that is a very good presentation, Nadine and Tando. That was beautiful.
Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you.
So was Carol, which Carol?
Carol Bremer Bennett.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
She's the president, yes?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So my boss,
wonderful.
which I like saying that now. I just was hired by Tier Fund USA full-time January 1. So my boss, Emily Sarmiento and Carol were on a call together sometime earlier this week. But so I used to live in South Africa, so I have a ton of questions. So I'm going to just keep asking questions if it's all right with you guys.
Sure.
Because it's something I see as a potential for the church worldwide, but the church in South Africa, how are we helping people move from advocacy to policy? So the reason why our parents are tired of the fight is because they were great at advocating for the immediate decision and reversal. How are we turning that into policy so that 100 years from now, your grandchildren aren't having to have these same issues? Because I think that's where we failed here in America in some respects. Now, policy, we also know, doesn't penetrate hearts. And so the church and citizens in South Africa and America have a dual responsibility of creating an infrastructure of fairness and justice. And the church has the role then of infiltrating our hearts to aspire, seek, crave that justice to the point that we change our behavior, that we die to self and self-interest and change our behavior. So I'd love to know, because politics in South Africa and the United States is murky, what is the church doing to help activists take their activism and create a new framework so that future generations don't have to fight these fights? Any thoughts on that?
I think we're seeing quite a bit of activism entering policy, and I think that started in Fees Must Fall. There were I know at UCT there were some economics students who went to Parliament and some doctoral economics students as well. I think they presented a opportunity for a sovereign wealth fund when we were still discussing around, can we afford free education? We see, I know in the space, in land space in particular, some churches have particular justice and peace desks. I know the Anglican Church, the Catholic Church, which engages with our parliament on various issues. I just got the Catholic Church's weekly mail on policy issues, and they have meetings with members of parliament quite frequently. And so we're seeing a lot of that, because it has been mentioned here as well that we can't really keep fighting on the streets and not changing our laws to really engage with us as citizens in our different communities in society. So we're seeing that not as quickly as we might like, but we're seeing that form quite a lot.
Yeah, and I think in theological education, like where the weakness really is the policy side. So it's wonderful. I can teach courses on community development. That's part of the work that I do. But then when it comes to policy, we become frightened. It's out of our scope. So and Ntando will agree, we have a protest culture. So this week, for example, currently we're experiencing rolling electricity blackouts. In fact, it was happening the whole time that we were doing this, but I'm privileged enough to have a UPS. So I have, and I think Ntando maybe as well, I'm not sure, but
Is that a generator?
No, not a generator, just a UPS to power my internet. So the lights were off and my other screen is off and so forth, but and the fridges are off and etc. But so we're having rolling power blackouts, and what's so bizarre is that the leading party wants to lead a protest against power blackouts. They're the ruling party of the country. We have blackouts because
who are they going to protest against?
They're going to protest against the blackouts that they've been part of. So, I mean, this is just a bizarre example, true but bizarre example of how we have a protest of culture, and there is a place for protest. I mean, I do believe that. But yeah, Beth, I mean, your question is pertinent, and I think it's one that in our faculty as well, in terms of training clergy, often the policy debates and discussions are left at the macro level of denominations, mainline denominations, and yet often service delivery issues like water and sewerage and those things are happening in local communities. And yet local clergy don't know who their local councillor is, their ward councillor, or how to engage. Because in South Africa, we have a great constitution. We have many good policies in place, but we don't know our policies. We don't know who to contact. So I think that's where strengthening needs to happen.
Yeah. The other piece of this, and it's the hard part. Well, all of this is hard. Am I kidding? Is that we all need to start to realize that the kind of change that we hope for in America, the kind of change we hope for in South Africa, will take generations. And so how do you sustain momentum for a reality you may yourself never get to experience? And I think of Moses, and Moses' journey, and knowing he was never going to cross into the promised land, but he still had to be faithful in leading, people towards it. And that was his part of the journey. And so I did some work with Habitat for Humanity in South Africa, went into communities, was doing a lot of research on their challenge of loan repayments, bond repayment rates and stuff. And what I kept hearing was, and this would have been late 90s, maybe early 2000s, President Mandela promised us a house, and we want it to be this one. And so the idea of the promises that politicians make it seem like they're going to bring that change about within their 4-year, I think you guys are 5-year presidencies.
Yeah. 4 years.
And that's misinformation. And I don't, blame Mandela. He is I teach him in every leadership class I teach because I love him. But how do we give our community the hard truth of the change that we want to see now and implement now? We won't really feel the full effects on for economic development, for jobs, for all of that, perhaps in our lifetime. And again, that's where I think the church should be front and center at that conversation, because that is where faith comes in. We keep pressing on because God calls us to it.
Yeah, but it's hard. I mean, it's really hard. So my parents were the 1960s and 70s activists, also within the church struggle in South Africa for racial reconciliation and justice. And often I would come home and say to them, because they're in their 70s, aren't you tired of the fact that all these things that you fought for, myself and then Ntando's generation back, and then my child who's 12, they're still experiencing that. Maybe I now, in a sense, I'm privileged, but I see the way majority of the populace of color is still experiencing those things. And if I go into my university, there are certain social injustices that I still have to confront, even with all the power and privilege that I have in the system. And my mother, that I think I shared this with you at one stage, and I think Black Lives Matter, and Fees Must Fall and stuff, had a big impact on us in South Africa too, because we felt that pain. We know that pain, and provoked a lot of conversations. And my mother said to me, you just have to keep on keeping on. That's what we're called to do. That's the calling. We have to keep on struggling and fighting for justice. God has called us to that. And I will go down doing this till the end of my days, whether it's with regards to women in leadership, which is her particular focus, or whether it's even engaging globally. She engages globally with other mission leaders, even on issues of neocolonialism. She said, we just have to keep doing it. So for me, very depressing. I said, no, this is not the way it should be. And I don't want this for my daughter. But yeah, I mean, we say in South Africa, we use the term luta continua, the struggle continues. But I'm sad that that's the case.
Yeah, well, and as somebody who has taught a lot about change and long-term change, it's where you then need to find those milestones to celebrate. To sustaining people for a long-term change, you've got to regularly celebrate what's different today than when your mom was doing this struggle. What's different today than 10 years from now, 10 years ago, and chart it out. Chart the celebrations and the small wins, they call it in the change literature. What are your small? Because it's the only thing, and celebrate it. Don't just say, oh, nice, check the box and keep moving, but finding ways to celebrate the small wins. And fees must fall, roads must fall. Those are huge wins that I do think will, are already leading and will lead to good policy questions for the way forward. Yeah. What do we memorialize?
For sure. I mean, this is one of the reasons why with the book launch, I wanted to memorialize and honor the student activists at that time, some of whom are part of the book. Ashwin is one of them, and he's a co-author. And then also one of the students is also was part of the bigger project. And so I really wanted to memorialize their contribution, because I remember at that time of Fees Must Fall, for a number of years since I came to Stellenbosch, our meetings were still in Afrikaans. And I remember saying to the fellow, there were 2 or 3 of us that were English speaking first language, I said to them, don't speak Afrikaans in the meeting. You speak English in the meeting, because there's a colleague that can't actually understand Afrikaans. And now someone has to interpret for him, rather than us all speaking English. Not that English is the Lord's language or anything, but just in terms of a common language that, that we could all understand. So I would tell the other colleagues, don't speak Afrikaans, you speak English. And for 3 years, I was constantly putting my hand saying, can we please, for the colleague, can we please speak in English? And immediately with Fees Must Fall, I recall the dean at the time said, right now, all meetings will from henceforth be in English. And this colleague said to me, you won. You won. And I said, what did I win? He said, well, we finally, all our meetings are going to be in English. And I said, well, actually, I didn't win anything. The student pressure is what conscientized the institution to the way that we were excluding you. So, I think that definitely, Beth, and that's why with the book launch, I really wanted to do that. For us to say, yes, this is a step in the journey, but there's still a way to go.
Hopefully someday that colleague will be able to say, we won. Because anytime you remove barriers that allow all of us to come to the table, anytime you remove those barriers, we win, we win, we win. And that's, might be a good place for us to pause and wrap up. I see the time up in my corner. So to pull this back to the Christian Alliance, this is exactly the challenge that I sit before us. Our dear friend Mimi Haddad, who's been doing this work for 30 years. I'm getting on a podcast with her in an hour. And I've often marveled at people who will stay the course for their advocacy work, who could easily go off and do other things. She could easily go be a professor somewhere, but she chooses to stay the course. And so may we all have such stamina. The Christian Alliance for Inclusive Development is bringing women together and uniting them to encourage each other on the journey towards justice. Our focus obviously is gender justice, but we also know the intersectionality of that. We can't change our sector for gender without also changing it for representation of our women of color who, dear Lord, don't let me die before seeing an African woman as the CEO of World Vision International, as an Asian woman as the CEO of Compassion International. There's no reason why that isn't happening. So, but bringing people together to have the hard conversations about how do we get better about advocacy on this stuff, and pushing for change, for policy change, for structure change, and for heart change. And that's where our Christian faith calls us to it and keeps us in it. So thank you again, both of you, for this conversation today. It's really rich. We're going to be sharing the video for tonight's session, since you'll both be sound asleep and well-deserved sleep. And I'm going to have Jackie put on the video the information about how you can sign up to be part of the Christian Alliance for Inclusive Development. Sign up for the Thursday table talks. Our next one, we're going to be hearing from brothers in the sector on what is the role of men in the Alliance, and what is the role of men as allies for women in the global development sector. So put that on your calendar for February 16, right after Valentine's Day in America. We're going to get a little love from the brothers, and we're going to show them some love right back. So, all right, friends, thank you again for all of this. And Jackie, thank you for your flexibility and letting us mix up the design of our session today. Any other parting thoughts, Nadine or Ntando?
No, just great being with you, just having this conversation, sharing the space together, especially the space with Ntando. It's always fun. And Yeah, just
So
great
appreciate
meeting the others like Barbara that's still on the call.
Yeah,
That call for the first time, Jackie, I know. So yeah, wonderful being with all of you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Just happy to finally know of the Christian Alliance. I hope to connect with you guys.
Yeah. And we're going to have you back on to celebrate when you are carrying that fancy piece. I call it fancy wallpaper. When you finish your doctorate, we'll be cheering you across the finish line. All right. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Jackie.